When you play a video game, you might assume everyone around the world is getting the same experience, but that couldn't be further from the truth. From censorship and content edits to full-on redesigns and tone changes, games often undergo major transformations when they leave Japan for the West, or vice versa. These changes aren't always about translation, they're often shaped by cultural sensitivities, rating board requirements, and marketing assumptions. Some games lose violence, others gain it. Some are stripped of religious themes, others have their characters rewritten entirely. Sometimes it's for localization, sometimes it's just for fear of backlash, and sometimes nobody really knows why. So today we're going to look at games that are completely different in Japan and explore what those changes say about the industry and its perception of global audiences. When Final Fantasy IV came to the US on the Super Nintendo, it didn't arrive as a faithful localization. It was rebranded as Final Fantasy II, since Final Fantasy II and III hadn't been released stateside yet, and it was heavily censored and simplified. The original Japanese version featured more complex mechanics, darker dialogue, and mature religious themes, many of which were toned down or cut entirely for the Western release. One of the most notable changes was to character abilities and spell names. Holy, a powerful white magic spell, was renamed White in the English version to avoid religious references. Dialogue was also softened. For example, characters who died in the Japanese version were often said to have simply fainted or disappeared in the US. The result was a game that retained its core structure, but lost much of its emotional weight. Even gameplay was affected. The American version removed several status effects and simplified the overall difficulty. The idea was that Western players were considered less experienced with RPGs. Today, the original uncut version is available through various ports and remasters, but the early SNES translation is a perfect example of how games were often reimagined to fit assumed Western tastes. Earthbound is now a cult classic in the West, but when it first released on the SNES, it was drastically altered from its Japanese version, Mother 2. Nintendo of America took an extremely cautious approach during localization, editing or removing a ton of content that might be seen as too dark, religious, or inappropriate for a US audience. Several enemies were changed entirely. For example, the happiest cultists wore robes resembling the KKK in the Japanese version. Religious symbolism like crosses in graveyards or on hospitals were removed. References to alcohol and drugs were also censored. Bars were rebranded as cafes, and drunken enemies were described as being dizzy or confused instead. Even sound effects and visual flashes were adjusted to reduce the risk of seizures. Despite its poor sales in America at launch, Earthbound has since become one of the most beloved RPGs ever made. But few fans realize how much the original version was left behind during its transformation for Western audiences. Resident Evil 4 is one of the most important survival horror games of all time, but the Japanese version of the game, Biohazard 4, is actually more censored than what Western players experienced. This might come as a surprise given Japan's reputation for allowing more mature content in anime and manga, but video games are held to a different cultural standard there. In Biohazard 4, certain graphic enemy deaths like headshots that explode into a shower of gore or chainsaw decapitations were toned down or completely removed. The Japanese version also removed dismemberment and toned down blood splatter, replacing many effects with simplified animations. The censorship was likely due to Japan's stricter CERO ratings and sensitivity toward extreme violence in interactive media. Ironically, while Western versions of the games are often censored to remove sex or religious imagery, Japan's censorship tends to focus more on graphic violence. Resident Evil 4 wasn't the first game in the franchise to be altered for Japan, but it remains one of the clearest examples of how the same game can play differently depending on which region you're in. Perhaps the most famous example of a game being completely different in Japan and the West is Super Mario Bros. 2. In Japan, the original sequel to Super Mario Bros., now called The Lost Levels, was considered too difficult for international audiences. Instead of localizing that game, Nintendo took a completely different game called Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic, reskinned it with Mario characters, and released that as Super Mario Bros. 2 in the West. This version featured very different gameplay from the original Mario formula. You picked up and threw enemies, pulled vegetables from the ground, and had 4 distinct characters with different abilities. It was only much later, through re-releases and compilations, that Western gamers discovered the real Super Mario Bros. 2. Interestingly, the Doki Doki version ended up being highly influential. Mechanics like these selectable characters and vertical level design would influence later Mario games like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario 3D World. It's a rare case where a localization decision created a game that arguably surpassed the original in legacy. Castlevania 3 on the NES is often praised for returning to the classic gameplay of the original after the more experimental Simon's Quest. But what many Western fans don't know is that the US version was heavily altered from the Japanese release. The Japanese version featured an advanced sound chip built into the cartridge, which gave it a richer and more atmospheric soundtrack. However, that chip wasn't included in Western NES hardware, so the music had to be downgraded significantly. Additionally, there were changes to enemy difficulty and some minor censorship. Religious symbols were altered or removed, and certain character designs were slightly toned down. Perhaps most notably, the localization also changed some of the story and the character relationships. The sorceress Sipha Belnades, for example, was referred to as a he in early US materials to downplay her gender. These kinds of changes show how regional assumptions about audience expectations, whether technical, cultural, or social, shaped the games we grew up with. The Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney series underwent a significant transformation during localization. It adapted a uniquely Japanese courtroom drama for Western audiences. The original games, set in Japan and heavily influenced by Japanese legal customs and culture, were modified to take place in a fictional version of Los Angeles. This required more than just translation. Cultural references, characters' names, and legal procedures were all altered. For example, the protagonist's name became Phoenix Wright, and various side characters received westernized names to make them more relatable to non-Japanese players. Food items like bento boxes were changed to hamburgers or hot dogs, and references to Shinto festivals or traditional customs were often rewritten or removed entirely. However, some Japanese elements still slipped through, creating moments of cultural inconsistency, such as characters celebrating distinctly Japanese holidays in an American setting. Despite the changes, the spirit of the series remained intact, and the localization team's creative work helped the franchise find massive success overseas. Over time, more recent entries have embraced a balance of authenticity and accessibility, allowing more of the original Japanese context to shine through. These are just a few of the games that changed significantly on their journey from Japan to the West. Whether due to cultural censorship, marketing decisions, or hardware limitations, these experienced players got often diverged wildly from what was originally intended. In some cases, the changes made the games more accessible. In others, they lost nuance or artistic intent. Understanding these differences helps us appreciate not just the games themselves, but the context in which they are made and localized. It also reminds us that gaming is a global medium, shaped as much by translators, marketers, and cultural gatekeepers as it is by developers. So the next time you play an old favorite, ask yourself, what version did I really play? So let me know down in the comments which of these surprised you, or if you knew about these, or if you've ever gone back to play the original Japanese version of a game. If you've enjoyed looking into this gaming history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you want more videos like this. Thanks for watching, I love you, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.